Hi, it's Dr. Bueller, and we're going to be talking today about the introduction to endocrinology. And we're going to talk a little bit about endocrine hormones and how hormones work, and then we're going to really focus on the hypothalamic and pituitary glands. So hormones are going to be only one method of signaling between cells and tissues. We also have synaptic signaling, and we have paracrine and autocrine signaling. For synaptic signaling, as you know, in the nervous system and cardiac, we have to have really fast connections. We have to get information from one cell to one secondary cell, pre- and postsynaptic. So we have to be able to go really fast and really specifically. For paracrine and autocrine, a lot of times we use it for inflammatory pathways. It has to be pretty fast, but it doesn't have to go very far. So it goes a fairly short distance just to neighboring cells or to the cell that released it itself. For the endocrine system, the idea is that we are going to circulate it to the entire body. So it's going to go into the blood circulation. The hormone itself is going to be seen body-wide. And by that I mean every cell in the body is going to be exposed to that hormone, and only the cells that have the receptor for that specific hormone are going to be affected. So when we talk about hormones, we want to remember that hormones are always synthesized inside a cell. So there's some specific endocrine cell that is devoted to one specific hormone. So each of these cells only has one hormone that it makes. You can have a cell that makes growth hormone or luteinizing hormone or gonadotropin releasing hormone, but it's not going to make all three. So these specialized cells are going to synthesize the hormone, they're going to package it as needed, and they're going to secrete it into the bloodstream. Because the blood is aqueous, if your hormone itself is lipophilic, then you're going to have a way for it to be able to get into and flow through this aqueous environment. So you're going to have serum protein carriers or serum carrier proteins. And those are going to hold on to that lipophilic hormone. And down here in the bottom right, you can see that fat-soluble hormone is going to actually bind to a transport that's going to get where it needs to go. Because these hormones are going into the entire circulation, they're really getting diluted very, very much. So they're an extremely low concentration when they hit their target cells. Because of that, the receptors that are activated by that hormone have to be very high affinity. If they're not, they're never going to have enough activation with that really low concentration of hormone. So remember, the whole body is being exposed, and only the cells that are expressing that specific receptor are going to respond. That allows the body to have one signal that can either be really selective at affecting one organ, or one signal that can now spread across and affect a lot of different organs in cooperation. So if you have a hormone like cortisol, you can then have it go through the bloodstream and have multiple organs and systems that have receptors for that, and coordinate the response to that hormone. Because this is in your circulatory system, the time course is going to be much longer than it would for, say, synaptic transmission. So normally we see a time course of minutes to days for each of these. And oftentimes we'll see them released in pulses. So maybe every 5 minutes you'll get a release, or every 24 hours you'll get a release. And then the other thing that you're going to see with these is they really have to have regulatory feedback. So you don't want to get into a situation where you're overproducing. So most of them are going to have a negative feedback loop where production of the final hormone is going to go back and stop the synthesis and release pathway. Although we do have some that are exceptions to that rule. So the first thing to think about when you're looking at the different kinds of hormones are there's three major classes of them. We have steroid hormones, which are all based on a cholesterol backbone. These are going to include the sex hormones, testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, dihydrotestosterone. They're going to include cortisol and aldosterone and some others. So the fact that they're cholesterol derived means these are lipophilic. And so because of that, as we said, they're going to require serum transport proteins. The binding to those serum transport proteins can be altered, and that's going to alter the concentration of available hormone in the blood. The peptide and protein hormones include insulin, insulin-like growth factor, growth hormone, antidiuretic hormone, oxytocin, and prolactin. These guys are water soluble, and again, they're peptide or protein. So think about if you were going to eat a steak, or if you're going to eat edamame, you're going to get this protein in your stomach. And what does your stomach do? It's really great at breaking down protein. It's got all these proteases. So with peptide and protein hormones, you can't take them PO. They'll just get broken down by the proteases. So when you look at things like growth hormone and insulin and prolactin, these are things that are given as injections. And so the last ones are going to be the amino acid-derived hormones, and those include epinephrine, thyroid hormones, and melatonin. And then addition to epinephrine would be norepinephrine. And so we talked about norepinephrine when we were talking about CNS, and we were talking about release from neurons themselves. And when we're talking about epinephrine, that's generally when we're referring to it then as adrenaline, and we're talking about more hormonal release. So we're going to cover some specific pathways today. And as I said, these are all going to be involved with the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. We're going to talk about several that are released from the anterior pituitary, and then a couple released from the posterior pituitary. And for every single one of these pathways, you could go and write an entire chapter on it. So we're going to try to just break it down and have you go away with the major important points. As you saw, we're going to talk about several different hormones that are derived from the hypothalamus and pituitary. And if you just look at them, they may each seem very different, and that might be very daunting to think about memorizing them all separately. But in reality, they're very, very similar. They all have the same setup. So they're all going to start in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to release a hormone, we're going to call it hormone A, into the blood in the case of the anterior pituitary. In the posterior pituitary, it'll be a little different, and we'll mention that in a moment. So when we're talking about these, we have the hypothalamus. There are actual neurons there. Those are releasing hormone A from the neuron into the blood, and that hormone doesn't have to go very far. It just goes to the anterior pituitary. And in the anterior pituitary, those are going to make and release hormone B. So hypothalamus released hormone A to the pituitary. The pituitary releases hormone B, and that goes into the full circulatory system. And that's going to be sent then through the circulatory system to the first target tissue. That primary target tissue is now going to release a third hormone, hormone C. Hormone C then goes through the bloodstream and hits our final or secondary target tissue, which has whatever major physiological effect we wanted it to have. And so you're going to see this little pathway for every single one of these hormones that we're going to look at. Again, we had hypothalamus. Hypothalamus releases hormone A onto hormone A receptors in the pituitary. Pituitary releases hormone B. Those hit hormone B receptors on a primary target cell. The primary target cell is going to make hormone C. That's going to go through the bloodstream, activate hormone C receptors, and then you're going to have whatever your final physiological output is. Like I said, these have to be under really strong feedback control. And so here, that final hormone C is often the one that's going to come up and give a negative feedback onto the hypothalamus, so you don't release as much hormone A. Sometimes it also comes and does a negative feedback onto the pituitary itself as well. But if you just think about this hormone as coming up and blocking this whole production of itself, that gives you the idea of what's happening here. Now, there is a big difference between the two sets of pituitary hormones depending on which lobe they're coming out of. We have the anterior pituitary lobe and the posterior pituitary. And the anterior is more toward the nose, and the posterior is more toward the cerebellum. I'm not going to hold you really responsible for knowing which one came from the anterior and which one came from the posterior, but I do want you to at least understand the difference between those in case that comes up again. So again, remember, individual cells are going to secrete only one specific hormone. So in the anterior pituitary, So in the anterior pituitary pathway, you've got these hypothalamic neurons. They're sending axons down. They're releasing hormone A into the bloodstream, which is going down, and then hitting these pituitary cells. These pituitary cells, these are cell bodies, are then activated to release hormone B into the bloodstream, and hormone B comes out and does what it's going to do on primary tissues. So this takes two different cells, the hypothalamic cell and the pituitary cell. So that's a two-step process. For the posterior pituitary, we basically just lose one step. So we go directly from the hypothalamic neurons to release into the bloodstream without a secondary cell type. So here we have the hypothalamic neuron. It sends through a longer axon down into the posterior pituitary, but instead of releasing onto cells, it's going to release directly into the bloodstream. And so that's going to be, say, the oxytocin or ADH are going to be released directly from this nerve terminal of the hypothalamic cell from a nerve terminal that's within the posterior pituitary. Now, we've already said multiple times that individual cells secrete one specific hormone. And the reason that I've mentioned this several times is because that's really important when you talk about diseases of pituitary and hypothalamic pathways. Because one of the main things that can happen here are when they're over-secreting tumors. So if a tumor develops in the cell types that create growth hormone, then growth hormone levels are going to be increased, but that doesn't mean cortisol levels are increased. So when we look at some specific diseases of oversecretion, we see some diseases involving increase in growth hormone, which we'll talk about, acromegaly or gigantism. We talk about thyroid hormone, cortisol, and hyperprolactinemia from increased prolactin levels. And those are some reasonably common tumor types.